pastors had chaplains, and the history, the people who had the authority to make that kind of work. And sometimes they don't represent the whole community. And it's the same right now. What I see is the terminology, even in any language, some words, and even in Spanish, we have the same word, but it has different meaning.
Right.
Yes. According with the community. That can be a barrier or can be a link for us. It doesn't matter, we speak the same language, Spanish. Some words can be offensive for somebody else, but some other words can be the same thing. And I noticed that that's the same in English. And because of the background, the history that we have, and the meaning that we give to the words, and the vocabulary is important. But also we need to be able to identify, okay, what is behind this word, according with you, because my perception can be completely different. And that can affect the way we get together.
To go back to your description of theology, we are doing theology. Theology cannot be done outside of community. This is community. Theology is being done within community. And if we try to break up that community, then we are no longer doing theology.
The question, which I don't think is mine, but one that belongs to the group, is about the book. And, you know, one of the most beautiful words that we could think of is soul. Does the book reach that lofty target? Even though you have this sort of historical anecdote to Herbert Anderson, even though we have this language engrafted in our covenant, does it reach that peak, or does it fall short? I think we are doing theology, we are doing some kind of work, we are in community, just as you say. But what about the book?
Yeah, I see that reaching Anton Boyson specifically, because in his self-exploration, examining that part of him that was not engaged and was left unattended by even the physicians of his day, he was able to reflect in a deeper way and make meaning out of his experience. And to me, that to me is the highlight of reaching out to a person's soul and recovering it. That's a good example for me, Anton Boyson. That's the first chapter or so in the book. And to me, that's a good example of how a soul is recovered.
I think you've raised the fundamental question for me of what this book is about. And as accurate or interesting or part of the story it is, I agree with you. It doesn't address to me what I was looking for in the book. And as fundamental as sexuality is to a person's being, it's about soul. And I think sexuality is a part of it, but it's not all of it. And I was thinking last night, it would be, to me, this book would sort of be like, if you were reading about the civil rights movement and they talked about Martin Luther King and they talked about how promiscuous he was. Well, that's true, but if that's what you focused on in the chapter about Martin Luther King was his sexual activity, you'd miss the essence of who the man was.
Amen.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's what this does. In a way, it reduces people to a one-dimensional, there's a one-dimensional focus. And as germane as that is to our humanity, it's only part of it. And I felt like it, I didn't feel like I got to know the essence of these people in this book, who are the forebears of this movement. I felt like I got to know a one dimension of who they were. And I think that was part of my frustration. I'm glad you voiced it.
So even in the case of Boyson, I see the work of a chaplain, maybe supervisor, who, for Boyson, the writings of Freud, Sigmund Freud, help him to navigate his turmoil, inner mental turmoil. And I see the work of a supervisor who accompany, stand beside, walk with the trainee to help him or her to recover.
Perhaps Boyson becomes a guiding figure in the book. Boyson's own sexual brokenness and the work that he's able to produce despite that in creating the clinical pastoral care movement is in its own way a parable that describes what happened in the larger movement. Tremendous brokenness.
Yeah.
The work continues.
And here we all are because of
Would you say that he was recovered?
I would prefer to say in recovery.
That brings me back to the title. Recovery of soul seems to have a flavor of finality, fixing, accomplishing. In recovery seems to be a process.
The language is fungible.
Because on my mind is the journey that we're still there. We are not done. But it's because of the language.
So why don't we use that as a shifting point? Journey's not done. And maybe we can take the journey outside of the small group, but I guess what I would like to do first is just to have the group do some process review or just comments on this group's work. And then we can ask Raymond to engage some of the questions that were brought up, and then we can continue that dialogue. That would be my thought. So just noticing this experience again this morning. Any thoughts or comments?
A theme that kept going through, I think Joshua started the framework of looking at what does it mean and talking about recovery of soul. What's your name? Janet put a lot of emphasis asking that last night and then again today, what is recovery of soul? And speaking with our General Secretary, something that he said that stayed with me is that soul is not the soul. It's soul as essence, something that cannot be touched. And as you were speaking in the dialogue, thinking about the title, Recovery of Soul, perhaps it's a challenge to us, rather than looking at it as a point of finality, that it is a challenge to us to continue in that journey. And we are here today as a body. What Helen did, as I said last night, as the woman, we're here because she pushed beyond even her own sexuality today in 2018. And from the beginning of the Bible, we're still dealing with it. In the Torah, we're still dealing with it. So it's not something back then, it's something that's current, that's now. I think if anything with this young generation, the millennials, that I appreciate about them, we come from, most of us, the baby boomers and the traditionalists, things happen and we put it under the rug. And we put it there and we got dressed up and we present ourselves. No, we're not going to put it on the rug. We're going to tell everybody.
Thank you for your comments, panel, and others. And if I'm not talking loud enough, make a signal. So much came up. If I can remember all, I made some notes. think a suggestion that this was a Judeo-Christian based book. Quite the opposite. The philosophical foundation of this book is purely agnostic. It does not believe anything. It doesn't even believe in the soul. Soul is an adjective, not a noun. There is no there. Soul food, there's nothing that you can scientifically examine around soul food. It's an adjective. So when you say the recovery of the soul, you've turned upside down the whole thesis of the book. Clinical training is completely, proper clinical training, original clinical training, is completely agnostic. It does not know any gods. It does not know any otherworldly business. It does not know any spirituality that is out of this world or up there somewhere. It is completely this worldly and completely agnostic.
Is that true of Boysen?
We can argue that at length, but yes, but we can debate that. But yes, he took the Christian hymn book and cut everything out of it that he didn't think was. Anyway, we'll talk about that some other time. We get off on a sidetrack if we pursue that. But it's a good question. The most difficult problem that all of us have, in doing our clinical work is that we will continually be put in a corner where we have to address some God. The Virgin Mary or Jesus or Buddha Buddha's not a god, Buddhism is atheistic, but some Hindu god of the many of the Hindu gods. We continually get put in a corner where we are asked to address the gods to do something. Now, if we submit to that, we're abdicating our clinical posture. We're abandoning our clinical role. But it's tough, of course, because you can't. Public relations requires that you act like a chaplain, and when somebody thinks you don't act like a chaplain, you might lose your job. So it's a tough call. But at least proper speaking, you should be as a clinician. You should take a completely agnostic posture, even atheistic posture. You do not know any gods, because none of the gods can be clinically examined or clinically assessed. In that sense, Judaism is the closest religion to clinical training, because Judaism is highly agnostic about the existence of any gods, even Yahweh, whom you cannot even supposed to say the name. It's so unreachable. Yeah, the question that my sister Lawrence raised about, and others have raised it about, is this book really about sex? Was Luther only about sex, as the Catholic Church maintains? Absolutely not. But because he broke the sex rule and married a nun to spite the Pope, which turned out to be a marvelous marriage, by the way, but that's why he married this stray nun who couldn't find a husband, and he felt like he could save this stray woman and also give a finger to the Pope. That's why he married Katie. As I say, it turned into a beautiful and long-standing marriage and a wonderful relationship. But that's how it began. But was Luther about sex? Absolutely not. But sex was the salient issue that the Catholic Church used to control Western civilization. And he was attacking the root of that control. And so it had to be sex. It was also authority, but sex was the big issue. Was Freud only about sex? Absolutely not. He was about integration of the personality and engaging the unconscious. And everywhere you go in that work, you are confronted with sex and the middle-class bourgeois controls of sexuality. Was Martin Luther King all about sex? Well, as we've already heard, absolutely not. He was for liberation of the African American community and equality, racial equality. But Martin Luther King didn't give a hang about middle-class bourgeois sexual ethics. And he had sex wherever he wanted to, wherever he wanted to. And the FBI director sent him a message, you either commit suicide or I'll expose you. And King said, well, expose me. My community is not going to undermine me. So Martin Luther King had him killed. Well, Martin Luther King was not only about sex, but he was about sex because he was driven to reform American society by establishing racial equality. And a corollary to that is sexual freedom. He was sexually free. So this book is not about sex, but because it's about self-fulfillment and liberation, you cannot escape dealing face-to-face with the issue of sexuality and the criminal way that the bourgeois American society oppresses sexuality and tries to deprive everyone of any sexual pleasure except what's for either procreation or within monogamy.
So any other comments, both to what was raised here, maybe to what Raymond was just
I
saying?
think she had something
Oh,
to
she
say.
does.
It was
I pulled you down.
Well, like I said, I don't really get conversations, but I'm an ex-Catholic. And Raymond, I loved your book. I think all of us I'm going to say I think, we are so all tied up with a pink and blue ribbon. And I read his book, and I did a lot of underlining. And what stuck out for me is on page 48. I want the students dumped, plunged deeply into life, brought up, grasping and dripping, and return to us humble and ready to learn. Until all students are faced with the tragedies, the contradictions, and the stark questions of life, they cannot understand the need for redemption of God's redemptive action. I want my students to lose as soon as possible their easy faith, their steady answers, and I want them to lose any hope of ever again having an easy faith or a ready answer. I want them to lose their personal conceits and their illusions about themselves, their illusions about their fellow men, and their illusions about God. I want their assumptions about ministry and their assumptions about how they're going to conduct their ministry completely destroyed. Woo! That is what we're about.
Judith, second name? Or is it Janet?
Janet.
Janet. She mentioned earlier that in the book sounded as if there is no forgiveness over what ACP has done. I appreciate Dr. Lawrence bringing that out into the forefront, because can there be true reconciliation if there's no forgiveness? And then what Joyce Parr read about, I want them to lose their personal conceits and their illusions about themselves. Well, I found that ACP was with this conceit and this illusion of themselves. They try to clean up their mess and hide it and look perfect. But I appreciate this organization because of the imperfection. And only in the imperfection can we connect with other human beings who are broken themselves. And I've heard it many times from people.
Regular leader, condemning his response to an 8-year-old. I'm sure you saw that. And yet these women were still defending the biblical authority of men teaching the Bible. And we have to understand, whether it be Judeo-Christian, even Baptist, I'm sorry, not Baptist, Baptist for sure, Buddhism, are patriarchal religions. And so sexuality, that red passion of, the red thread of passion comes out as anger, comes out as sex. And sex you cannot dissect from power and authority. And our patients are lying in beds with that cultural context that I think puts this front into that circle.
To the degree that the book embodies anger and a lack of forgiveness, when can we say, this was somebody else's fight? This was not my fight. I don't have a dog in this fight. This happened long enough ago, and I want to think about forgiveness.
Where's the lack of forgiveness you're referring to? There's no lack of forgiveness in this book. I object to that charge. All is forgiven. This is just telling the story. If ACP calls us tomorrow morning and says, let's have a conference and get together and talk, we'll be right there. Anytime, any day. They won't talk to us.
Does the book have no anger in it?
I don't know. You tell me. What anger is it? It's the story of our history.
Right. I thought the book had outrage. I don't know if that could be construed as anger.
I think it can be.
Well, you don't want to hear the story of the past and the outrage and the.
I didn't say that. I didn't say. I think the story is important. My question is, at what point?
So what's wrong with anger?
At what point does this story?
What is wrong with anger? Anger.
Nothing
anger
at all.
Can be a conduit for change.
Nothing at all. Nothing is wrong with anger. But at what point is this book history? And at what point is this living?
Well, you began with, I began with you with there is no forgiveness in this book. That's what I'm objecting to.
I was using some of the language that was recently spoken.
May I? Yeah, I was going to say, I'm abdicating my moderator. Rebecca is going to jump in. Because I think what you just said did, there was some resonance. Because Raymond, what I hear in your language is not a language of forgiveness. It is a language of some rage. And it, to me, doesn't seem pastoral in its approach. So if I were to engage someone who I had a problem with, I would tend not to use incendiary language to engage what I hope to be a dialogue. Because to me, it came across as separating instead of incorporating.
If you don't call a spade, you never get anywhere. Following Luther, following the prophets, following Martin Luther King.
Shrews?
If you don't call a spade, you never move anywhere.
Okay.
So I'm curious then, do we hold and carry in this room the collective unconscious?
Sure.
As asking for a response or anything?
Well, I'm just putting it out there. You have a response?
No.
No, okay.
Well, I guess I do. I don't know how you
Okay.
get away from collective unconsciousness.
I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, we're all inter.
And it's the collective unconscious of our culture, of our religious traditions, of all kinds of stuff. You tell me with all that, I see that.
So that history that what I'm hearing, the history that we're wrestling with or struggling with is brought alive, perhaps differently, into this room.
Well, the reason I wrote the book is that I was thinking that one of these days I may die, and
Maybe.
maybe. And
Provided the hype goes forever.
and I was aware that I knew a lot of stories that other people didn't know, and that if I didn't put them on paper, that they may be lost forever.
That's true. Well, that's true.
Well, what is written is important. There's no disagreement there.
I'm still curious what happened starting in 1990. I want to hear your story from where you ended forward, because I feel like that's a big piece that's missing.
How long have you got?
Should write another book.
Yes. But of your history and your story at that point.
Well, it's true that from 1990 on with CPSP, there's not much in this book because too many of the actors are still living. It's much easier to write about Boysen and Freud because they're dead, and Jesus and Plato, they're dead. So you can say everything, but that'll have to be left to you to write.
I need to hear it.
What?
It gives me life. If I feel like I'm dying inside, then I need to hear it. If I'm dying inside, I need to hear it because it gives me life. Although those other people are still living, and perhaps I'm maybe misinterpreting, and it was interpreted as laughter, but I sense some fear there of what will they think. But you're here in this space, hearing what we think.
Well, no, I'm not afraid of what people think that if I write about living people, but I don't want to write things that would cause people to lose their jobs.
Okay, I understand. Fair?
Too much.
Even for Luther.
Well, he's dead.
Reverend Florence, I just wanted to ask, as far as there was this discussion of what recovery of soul means in this book. Would you be willing to pick up this question from yesterday? Like, what does it mean for you? Why did you call this book Recovery of Soul?
That's a good question, a tough question. What does it mean, recovery of soul? Well, it means a lot of things, but it means to find your voice. It means to find your values, your commitments. It doesn't mean to find any gods. That's outside the arena of the clinical. I don't know, help me, what else is it?
What did it mean in 1990 when CPSP was founded?
That's a good question. In 1990, what it meant was a band of 15 people who felt increasingly estranged from their profession, their calling as supervisors, as clinicians, increasingly isolated and under threat of being defrocked or removed from the profession, because the ACPE was the only union in the country. If you're out of the ACPE, you were finished professionally. You'd have to go drive a truck or whatever. So an increasing number of people, 15 came together, including me, and I knew, given what I believe and the way I practice, I knew that I would not be very long being a clinical pastoral supervisor, because I would lose my credentials. I was being gunned for because of all the things I was writing. Contra Mundum, the newsletter I wrote, it excited a lot of people, and a lot of people subscribed, and a lot of people liked it, but I was doomed. I mean, the ACP was going to take my credentials sooner or later. It was too much rage against me, even though I had a lot of support. So that's why we began, and we were anxious, and furthermore, we didn't even know that creating CPSP would be successful. 15 people against 500 is not good odds unless you're David.
Can you talk about the gender makeup of those 15 people?
There were only, I think, 3 women, 2 or 3, not many. The gender makeup that's a good question, because for the first decade, and we talked about this yesterday, there were very few women joined us, because the women's liberation movement in ACPE was pretty hostile to males generally. Quite understandable. I mean, when women enter a male profession, it's going to be mainly angry women who have to force their way in with a hatchet, and a lot of them did. And the ministry was all male. When I was coming up, the ACP with 500 supervisors had 2 women, both up in the Northeast. Supervisors, only 2. But there were no women clergy, so there was no reservoir to draw from. So it was a whole social cancer. So if you don't have women ministers, you can't have women supervisors. And so
what about racial?
Huh?
Racial makeup.
The racial makeup was not as problematic, but it was, in part, that's another story. Let's finish this story. Because there were no women ministers, there were no women supervisors, and then the culture began to change. But as I said, I guess I'm repeating myself, but as I said, the women who pushed the way forward and the aggressive women who got women admitted tended to be either aggressive or homosexual or well, angry, certainly. So that created a kind of a war, and a war against men. And that's the way history works. I mean, the people who change things that don't turn out always to be the most psychologically healthy. And so we, in CPSP, we were in the beginning, the phalanx that met us was largely female, not entirely, but largely female and impotent males, or silent males who were tongue-tied, who couldn't speak. And nobody in the ACB found a way to engage us. They would, even though we got national notoriety very quickly with my newsletter, not once did anybody call from the national office and say, let's sit down around a table and talk. Not once. That might have solved everything. If we could hash out the issues, hash out our concerns, if the women could have been heard, and there could be more promotion to bring women into ministry. Nobody who had power took the initiative. I got not one single phone call from the ACP office in the past 30 years.
I'm not sure I heard you correctly. Did you just use homosexual and aggressive as synonyms, or were you making a different?
Not synonyms, no. But a large contingent of the women who were ministers in that and supervisors in that early phase were homosexual. That's natural. When one gender enters a profession that is the other gender, you're going to mainly bring homosexuals. That's in the nursing profession. You have men who enter nursing. A large portion of them are homosexual. That's an observed sociological fact.
I just wanted to try to hear you better.
I'm not making a moral judgment about it. It's just the way it is. Now, 30 years later, things are different. I mean, when women are. I mean, we have half women here. I don't think there's not a clear identification of a kind of gender among the women and men here. I mean, I don't know who's homosexual or heterosexual. I mean, you can't tell, generally speaking, unless they stand up and announce it. But in the early days, you had this. You had the women were fighting women, and largely homosexual.
So coming back to recovery of soul, you were telling the story of how it happened, but the recovery of soul at that time meant that people, these 15 people, could not be theological, being chaplains anymore? Just trying to clarify.
Well, I would say a recovery of soul was a recovery of voice, was a recovery of autonomy, of authority, of confidence that they could continue doing their work. Instead of being in a job where I suspected that any day I would get a phone call from the certifying body that I was under charge of something, some ethical charge, I relaxed. I mean, I could work better because I had the backing of significant peers. And as CPSP grew, my backing was stronger. It was a risky time. I mean, we put our professions on the line. The 15 who met put their profession on the line.
We've got about 5 more minutes. Is there anything that needed to be?
I want to go back to Andrew's question about the racial mix-up that you did. You said that's another story. Because I'm wondering, blacks, Hispanics in the group at this time?
I can't recall for sure whether we had any Hispanics or blacks in the 15. I can look at the list and tell you I don't remember, and it wasn't something I focused on.
I can tell you no.
No, okay. But Francine would know.
I imagine not.
So, but it was not long before the minorities joined us. And as you see from here, I mean, we're hardly
My own
white.
footnote to that, Raymond, is that was a time where women had no voice in the organized church. The African American and in the Methodist tradition had their own conference, as opposed to the white conferences. CPE, both organizations, was an avenue to move into a place where you could have voice. You could be a priest who had no voice in their Catholic denomination or parish because of their struggling with issues that were not acceptable. They found voice in CPSP and ACPE. And there's a reason why nuns came into those organizations, and priests and other people who were not seen as the norm and were not accepted because of their voice. And so whether the numbers were lopsided at that time, look at the culture at that time, and the religious culture at that time. If you had thoughts that went beyond literal biblical principles, you couldn't say them in your denomination. You didn't have a following. If you did, you were at risk. You could move into this group and you could begin to continue to, or you can explore your own theological differences from your roots. So there is still, even though imperfect, it was a porthole to moving and knowing you had value and a voice in moving into an organization that was filled with like-minded but very different individuals. And it was awkward. And we are awkward. And so that reminds me of where this whole pathway has been. And we are. You can go to any of your denominational gatherings. I mean, they're stilted many times. They look all alike many times.
That's true.
And I celebrate that, and I just wanted to add to Raymond's that this was a portal. It's not the end. We can open up more portholes. But anyway, that was my observation of it at the time.
Let's get a small group a hand. Let's give yourselves a hand who participated. I just want to take out a couple of things before we leave out. I want to thank Raymond for writing the book.